Hello all, I hope you're well in these extraordinary times. I'd like to welcome you all to the Fintech Finance Virtual Arena where I'm hosting you here today. We're going to be assessing the impact of COVID-19 on the fintech industry globally. So joining me today is none other than Tania Ziegler, the head of global benchmarking at the Cambridge Centre for Alternative Finance. And they're partnering with the World Bank and the World Economic Forum for the Global COVID-19 Fintech Market Rapid Assessment Survey. So without further ado, Tania, can you give me a bit of background to yourself and the Cambridge Centre for Alternative Finance?
Yeah, sure. First, thanks so much. It's lovely to be here. And I know it's a mouthful. The study's got a really long name. But yeah, so I'm Tania and I'm the lead of global benchmarking over at CCAF. The Cambridge Center for Alternative Finance is a research department at Cambridge University Judge Business School that is really dedicated at understanding, how alternative finance has evolved over these past few years. And this study in particular looks at how financial technology firms are reacting and adapting to COVID-19. So yeah, that's our study.
Absolutely brilliant. Well, I mean, I guess it's quite a mouthful because you guys are really looking at such a broad spectrum in terms of this study. So, I mean, it's also been interesting to hear about this study because for the last couple of months on the virtual arena, we've been hearing about what fintechs can do, what banks can do when it comes to helping businesses and people deal with COVID-19 financially. But from what I can tell from the study, can you tell us what COVID-19 has done to the fintech industry?
Yeah, sure. Again, loaded question, but COVID-19 certainly being a health crisis, has reverberations that are affecting every aspect of life, social, societal, financial. And so it's made it really necessary to treat this threat as a seriously destabilizing force in, traditional financial markets and certainly in those that are alternative as well. So this study has really been around assessing what that shock has been for fintechs. I mean, certainly when COVID first came to the scene, it definitely was a shock. But after a couple of weeks, we've seen a lot of fintechs realize that, COVID-19 also has the potential of changing the opportunities in how they service their existing clients, but also how they might service new opportunities or new clients as well. So it's definitely forced fintechs to really rely on what they're good at, actually, which is, that digital transformation that they've definitely, mastered in the past, and now is really kind of what's being tested. And I think that from our perspective, that's kind of what COVID-19 has presented. Certainly many challenges, but definitely opportunities for somewhat nascent ecosystem that, that has evolved, but evolved with that digital transformation.
Yeah. And, speaking of that transformation and the past, have some of these changes been completely new to the fintech ecosystem? Or can you imagine some of the changes we've seen as a result of COVID have come about as a continuation of what was happening before?
Yeah, I think digitalization is definitely an ongoing trend, and COVID's just kind of hastened that further. What we're seeing are like increased collaborations between traditional financial institutions and fintechs. And that was a long-term trend that we were noting before, but this has kind of made it more necessary. So you're seeing fintechs that are not just working with, with more like banks and traditional sector, but also, with government, with the public sector. And that's really been spurred by the fact that they can provide a digital online solution. Arguably, you could say that the whole financial technology ecosystem kind of grew out of the 2008 crisis, and they were largely able to adapt because of an emphasis on digitalization and emphasis on embracing, those financial technologies online. And, COVID-19 in that respect is no different. It's forcing people to really, increase their online savvy, increase their use of those different digital platforms. And so from that perspective, fintech is sort of a natural solution to some of the problems that COVID has forced upon us. Digitalization is definitely an ongoing trend, and it's really clear to see that the fintech ecosystem is at the forefront of it.
Brilliant. Now we've got those kind of broad strokes outlining the fintech industry in the past, onto your study. One thing we gather at Fintech Finance is just really how broad the fintech industry actually is. So how did you go about classifying what a fintech is for your study?
That's a great question, because the answer is that fintech is super broad. We spent a lot of time developing our taxonomy. Obviously, we're a university-based research department, so taxonomies and developing lexicons are really important to us. But we've actually kind of taken the view that this taxonomy needs to be treated as something of a living document, and it has to be reactive to the evolution of the ecosystem and of the different models. So in the first instance, we're looking at this taxonomy from the perspective of the activities that these different fintechs operate within. And ultimately, we now are looking at sort of 15 overarching verticals or categories. And within those verticals and categories, we'll have anywhere from 8 to 11 different subcategories or submodels to really kind of pinpoint the core product or the core activity that firm is operating within. And certainly, we're looking at everything from the digital lending, digital payments, capital raising models, all the way through to the more enterprise technology or market provisioning activities like reg tech, alternative credit, alternative data, AI, machine learning. So to say that this is all encompassing would actually kind of be understating it.
Yeah, that's incredible. And I guess with that in mind, what is the timescale of your study?
Yeah, we've only got about 3 weeks left on data collection. So we started our collection on June 15th and we're closing it on June 31st. So when we talk about a rapid assessment, it's rapid in every sense of the word. We decided to do this study kind of off of the back of our existing online benchmarking work that we do, which is a time series analysis we've been running since 2015, with data going back as far as 2013 in the digital lending and capital raising arena. And we repeat our panel every year. So when we were getting ready to collect our 2019 data, that was kind of when COVID was really kicking off, and we realized that if we ignored that, we wouldn't, we would be really missing a critical part of the conversation on how, fintechs are reacting. So we very rapidly shifted the entire study to include a number of other verticals. And now our assessment is very directional in nature. So many of the questions that we ask are based on how fintechs are seeing the market react and how they are reacting to the market. So it's more it's more directional than rather asking for specific figures. We then close the survey on July 31st. We're going to spend the month of August going through sanitation, verifying responses, and making sure that the data is accurate, correct, and reflective. To that end, we're working with a lot of different fintech associations and bodies. They kind of serve as a sounding board to make sure that what we're seeing in the data is reflective in what's actually happening on the ground. In September, we're going to do the write-up. So again, really rapid. And the idea is to actually publish this report by the end of September so that it can be out in the front of the public, freely accessible from October 1st. So rapid being the critical word.
Well, congratulations. I mean, that's an incredible timescale. And kind of going back to the timescales, and obviously you're taking quite a bit of quantitative data as well. And a lot of fintechs are time poor. What are the typical kinds of questions that get put to these fintechs? Are you allowed to tell us that before we check out the study?
Yeah, absolutely. So we have sort of 4 overarching themes within the survey. The first is those changes in fintech market performance. And that's where we have that directional approach. So we've opted rather to ask for directional indications of changes rather than specific numerical data points, largely because this is happening right now to firms. So it's really hard to provide a snapshot, as it's happening. But these questions kind of look at how market performance has changed in terms of transaction volumes, customer acquisition, loan default rates. But if you're an insurtech, premium lapses, all of the questions in these sections are very related to your model type. So although we do have some questions that everyone receives, we've tried to be very mindful of the fact that not every model and not every fintech is built the same way and operating in the same way. We then have a series of questions that look at the specific COVID-19 responses that fintech firms are taking. So we're asking firms to indicate, how they've modified their existing products or services. What kind of adoptions have they had to make with respect to changing the way that they do their fees or their commission, all the way down to what changes might be happening on their onboarding or their KYC, so on and so forth. We really want to understand how COVID has changed the way that they access and service those clients and customers. We then look at operational changes. Again, these are firms that are like living in this COVID-19 situation, just like the rest of us, having to go online, having to change the way that they access their data, having to change the way that they run their operations. It's really important to understand what those pitfalls might look like, but also how those fintechs have risen to the occasion. And one might even argue that because they're already quite digital, that's been a really seamless transition. And that's kind of what we're seeing also from some of the comments that we're seeing in the study. And then finally, and I would argue that this is probably the most important part of the study, is that we're trying to understand the kind of regulatory support or policy assistance that financial technology firms need within the jurisdictions that they operate in. The implication of fintech regulation and policy has always been an important component to the research that we conduct. But in this case, we're specifically soliciting, firms to shed light on, on the regulatory or governmental assistance or support that they might need, not just in terms of the things that they're doing to support different government schemes or initiatives, but also what they need to see from their regulator, what they need to see from their supervisor in order for them to continue scaling, scoping, and definitely continue servicing clients, in a post-COVID environment as well.
Yeah, that's really interesting because kind of as I mentioned in my first question, is we often talk at FinTech Finance of how the kind of the fintechs are helping everyone else, but it's interesting to see how the regulators maybe and governments maybe even also trying to help fintechs because they are businesses themselves. So from this virus, it's pretty obvious to see the huge changes in regulatory and government involvement in businesses. Almost anecdotal, or if you can let me know from maybe some of the the answers you may have seen already. Do you think that government assistance has been kind to the fintech industry in comparison to other industries?
Hard to say right now, because again, we're looking at a study that's looking at over 190 different countries and jurisdictions. And so, when you're looking at regulation or policy in one place or one country, it's going to maybe look a little bit different to somewhere else. And so you have seen some countries, particular in like Latin America, where, like, for example, in Paraguay, the, digital payment fintechs and the sort of telco fintechy area, they've been a critical component in distributing funds, right? So you've seen how government has actually utilized the fintech infrastructure there. Whereas in other places, you've kind of seen it maybe not be included in conversations, not get included in, in considerations on fiscal stimulus packages and things like that. So it's safe to say that financial technology is probably going to be a crucial part of the solutions that governments and regulators are going to consider, especially going into 2021. But equally so, they need to have an evidence base. And I think a lot of times, they need to understand what the capacity of these platforms looks like. So hopefully this study will be able to shed some light there, because while there are definitely governments and different policy schemes that are making use of fintech already, one of the interesting findings that we're seeing from at least the interim report is that digital lending platforms, digital payment platforms, but even a number of the crypto platforms and a number of the sort of more market provisioning platforms have indicated that, hey, we feel like we can do more. We feel like we can participate not only in, government schemes, but also in more broadly industry schemes, to help support the rest of the ecosystem. So I think that this is going to be a critical finding, actually. And it's a mixed bag because, again, 190 different countries and jurisdictions are getting covered. They're not all the same.
Can completely imagine. And going back to more towards your study, how do you look at covering so many different countries in the study?
With difficulty.
Yeah, I can imagine.
We are relying a lot on our partners. So we have, we've been really lucky in that because this study is being jointly run with the World Economic Forum and the World Bank. Obviously they've got really good networks, but then quite critically, we're working with a lot of local, regional fintech associations and bodies. In fact, we're kind of at that sort of 100 mark where we have these partners that are helping us on outreach, helping us on dissemination. Certainly conversations like this help reach platforms as well. For us, though, it's really important that the survey gets a sufficiently robust data set, because we want to be able to talk intelligently and accurately about all of these different models, because all of these different models are going to have nuances that are going to be critical to how we deal with COVID in the next sort of, well, now, but also in the next sort of 18 months. So we've been doing a lot of our outreach, where we're going through, and we spent a lot of time identifying firms within pretty much every jurisdiction possible. We really looked at, we did a lot of desktop research basically to make sure that we were capturing the right number of firms. And then with that, we liaised a lot with our partners to make sure that we're also capturing, firms within their networks. So it's a lot. It's a hard job, but we feel like somebody's got to do it, and we're up to the task.
I imagine you are. And I've got to ask as well, once you have this brilliant data set and you've looked at the results, you mentioned obviously how the kind of the definition of a fintech can change so quickly, and you've added that kind of openness to your taxonomy. What is this study going to be able to provide governments and businesses and regulators going forward post-COVID?
For us, again, the study is really going to create that empirical evidence baseline that not only we need as researchers, but I think that government and policymakers need. Unfortunately, COVID-19 is going to create sort of a whole new Delta knot, and we need to be able to have time series data, evidence-based empirical data to create a baseline, so that actually when we look forward, we know where we at least started. So we hope that this, and we believe that it will, have an impact on how regulators perceive, and government perceive the financial technology space. Hopefully, it also really highlights, the attention, like you said, that the fintechs need in order to scope and scale. One of the things that we're seeing a lot, or from some of the responses that we're getting, is that, fintechs need regulatory support on doing some of their sort of online onboarding and things like that. So the way that they do business has also changed, and that needs to be acknowledged by, government, by regulators, by policy, and the industry itself. The only way you can do that is if we understand what that looks like and we understand the problem. To that end, previous reports that we've done, they tend to get utilized pretty evenly between government and regulators, and also the industry itself. We expect that will be the same with this study.
Excellent. And kind of going back to a broad kind of top-down look at the fintech industry, do you think that the fintech industry is actually going to come out of the COVID-19 virus better than maybe other industries?
Well, personally, I think that will be the case, but that's, why we need an evidence base and why we want to sort of test that hypothesis. But that is the hypothesis that I kind of think is an accurate assessment. Again, these platforms are already digitally enabled. They're already conducting their business online. And frankly, it's been, all of the other industries that have had to revert their entire business model to do effectively what these platforms have been perfecting, anywhere from the last 5 to 10 years. So you really, you kind of see how they're positioned well for success. That being said, this has been, this crisis has been a shock in every possible way. And so we also then need to see, how different businesses within verticals are going to react. I mean, if you're a really young fintech in beta, how has this impacted your ability to scale and scope? If you're a unicorn, for example, how has that impacted or consolidated perhaps some of your market share? So there's always going to be nuance. I think there's also, certain model types are perhaps more suited than others to address some of the needs that we see. So like, if you have a strong consumer finance focus, well, then perhaps you're really going to be in a good position to deal with this crisis. Whereas if your clients are also suffering, that might have an impact on you as well. So there's so many variables, and this is exactly what we need to be testing. Within the survey, we ask about the different client and customer bases to really try to get at that nuance. So even if you're super well positioned, it doesn't necessarily mean the environment that you're within is. So that's part of the hypothesis, and we really need to determine, okay, well, what's more important, and hopefully we can shed some light on that.
Well, I'm really interested to see that distinction and difference. Can I actually ask Tania, is there anything you would like to say to potentially some of our audience about the study that we may not have covered yet?
I think it's more just please participate. We really need platforms to come along and also to really interact and have this debate. There's definitely elements of this study that also really reflect on how financial inclusion has been impacted by COVID-19. In fact, one of the kind of mandates that we sort of been tasked with from our partners is to really consider how COVID-19 has impacted financial inclusion, or perhaps financial exclusion as well. So these are certain things that we're sort of testing and looking at. And I think that, I would probably just say that by participating in this study, we can create an evidence baseline that will then inform some of the research and some of the critical themes that we need to be paying more attention to in coming months. So if you want to be part of the conversation and you want to have your voice heard, this is a great way to do it. I think for firms that are coming onto this that have never worked with CCAF before, it's probably worth just mentioning that when we do collect our data, after sanitation and verification, it is always anonymized. So we never report information or data at a firm level basis. We only ever report either by model or by jurisdiction. And if we feel or see that there's insufficient data for it to be sufficiently robust, we just don't include that statistic. So we take data security really seriously, especially in light of COVID. And so we just want you guys to know that too.
Excellent. And lastly, I've got to ask Tania, how do these fintechs get involved?
The best way to get involved is through the survey link that I think is going to be provided in this interview here. We have two versions of the survey. We have the COVID questionnaire only, and that's really suitable for firms that have kind of never worked with us before. We then have a survey that includes the COVID-19 survey plus our time series benchmarking data. That's suitable for digital lending and digital capital raising platforms. So as I mentioned kind of at the start of our conversation, we've been running an alternative finance benchmarking study on an annual basis for the last several years, where we collect total volume and just certain time series based data. We are doing that again this year. It's really important that we continue that tradition. So if you are a digital lending platform or capital raising platform, please take a look at that survey as well.
Brilliant. Well, thank you very much for your time, Tania. It's been absolutely insightful, and I hope the study goes well. And to all our viewers, obviously, check out the links below where you should be able to participate in the study, and make sure to catch the rest of the Virtual Arena series at www.fintechf.com. See you next time.